This presentation contains descriptions of extreme violence, betrayal, and disturbing themes derived from ancient Norse mythology. Viewer discretion is advised. What if the most famous fantasy story of our time wasn't an invention? What if the One Ring, the cursed gold that brings doom to all who possess it, was a legend centuries before J.R.R. Tolkien ever put pen to paper? What if the broken sword, reforged for a king returning from exile, wasn't born in the mind of an Oxford professor, but in the heart of a dark and bloody Norse epic? And what if Smaug, the great dragon brooding on his stolen treasure, was just a shadow of an older, more terrifying beast? These aren't just passing similarities. They are the foundational pillars of The Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien lifted them, sometimes piece by piece, from one of the most brutal and tragic tales ever told, the saga of the Volsungs. This is the story of a bloodline cursed by the gods, a family destined for glory and unimaginable suffering. It's a tale of incest, dragon-slaying, prophetic birds, and a thirst for vengeance so profound it echoes through generations. But it raises a terrifying question. Tolkien was a man who believed in hope, in the victory of good over evil. So why did he draw his deepest inspiration from a story that has no hope? A story that ends in nothing but fire, blood, and despair? To find that answer, we must go back to the beginning. Not to a hobbit hole, but to the halls of Asgard, and to a god who was not a hero, but a master of war and a weaver of fate. Our story begins with the Allfather himself, Odin, not the noble king you've seen in movies, but the primordial Norse god of poetry, death, and betrayal. The one-eyed wanderer who roamed the earth, stirring the pots of men, seeding conflicts, and choosing the champions who would die for him and feast in his halls at Valhalla. And like all gods, he had children. One of his sons, a man named Sigurd, was cast out of his homeland for a terrible crime. In a fit of jealous rage, Sigurd had murdered another man's servant, a thrall, simply because the man was a better hunter. It was a petty, dishonorable killing, and for it, Sigurd was declared an outlaw, a wolf in the woods to be killed on sight. But he was Odin's son, and the Allfather does not abandon his own. Through his divine influence, Odin guided the outcast Sigurd, transforming the murderer into a marauder, the marauder into a warlord, and the warlord into a king. Sigurd carved out a brutal kingdom for himself in the land of the Huns, a realm built on conquest and fear. He ruled with an iron fist, a testament to the violent blood that flowed through his veins. But the treachery he was born from would eventually be his undoing. His wife's own brothers, envious of his power, conspired against him, ambushing and killing the old king. The cycle of betrayal had begun. Sigurd's son J.R.R. avenged his father with fire and steel, slaughtering his uncles and seizing the throne. He became an even greater king than Sigurd, his kingdom expanding, his wealth growing. Yet a shadow hung over his great hall. He and his queen were barren. They had no heir to carry on the bloodline of Odin. For years they prayed to the gods, making sacrifices, begging for a son. Finally, the Allfather heard their pleas. He plucked a single apple from the mythical gardens of Asgard and gave it to a giantess, one of his many servants, who took the form of a crow. She flew to J.R.R.'s kingdom and dropped the apple into the king's lap as he sat atop a burial mound. J.R.R. understood. He went to the queen and they shared the fruit. Soon the queen was with child. But the divine intervention came at a cost. The pregnancy was unnatural, monstrous. 1 year passed, then 2, then 5. For 6 long years the queen carried the child, her body wasting away, the kingdom holding its breath. King J.R.R., who had longed for a son, never saw him. He was killed in a war, leaving his pregnant queen to rule alone. Finally, knowing her own death was near, the queen gave a final command. The child was to be cut from her womb. And so he was born, a boy not of natural birth, but of cold steel and a dying wish. He was already a young man in size and strength when he took his first breath, and they named him Volsung. Volsung grew to become the mightiest king the North had ever known. He was fierce, wise, and his name was legend. He married the same giantess who had brought the apple of his birth, and she bore him 10 sons and 1 daughter. The 2 eldest were twins, a son named Sigmund, and a daughter named Signy. They were said to be the fairest and strongest children in the world. King Volsung, in his power and pride, built a magnificent hall, a palace of timber and gold, and at its very center, he left a living tree growing up through the roof. its massive branches spreading out to shade the great hall. The tree was called Barnstokker, the child trunk, and it stood as a symbol of his family's strength and vitality. For a time there was peace. Volsung and his 10 sons were a force no army could challenge. They were the favorite of Odin, a dynasty of warriors destined for greatness. The great hall was filled with laughter, the clashing of drinking horns, and the songs of victory. But fate is a cruel master, and the favor of the gods is a fickle thing. A powerful Viking from the south, Sigurd, the king of the Goths, heard tales of the beauty of Volsung's daughter Signy. He sailed to Volsung's kingdom and asked for her hand in marriage. Volsung, seeing a powerful political alliance, agreed immediately. But Signy did not. From the moment she laid eyes on King Sigurd, a cold dread filled her heart. She saw a cruelty in him, a darkness that repulsed her. She begged her father to call off the wedding, telling him that this union would bring nothing but ruin and death to their entire family. But King Volsung was a proud man. He would not break his word for the sake of a daughter's premonition. He told her that fate was fate and what must be must be. The wedding would proceed. And so, King Sigurd and his men traveled to the great hall of King Volsung. A massive feast was prepared. The fires roared, the ale flowed, and the 2 kings sat in places of honor. But as the celebration began, a storm raged outside, and a strange mood fell over the hall. Signy sat beside her new husband, her face a mask of sorrow, her heart pounding with the sense of impending doom. Then the great doors of the hall were thrown open. A figure stood silhouetted against the raging storm. He was a towering man, old and imposing, with a long gray beard. He wore a hooded cloak, and where his right eye should have been, there was only an empty socket. He strode into the hall, his footsteps silencing the music and the laughter. No one dared to speak. In his hand he held a sword, a blade that seemed to drink the firelight, its edges gleaming with a light of their own. Without a word, the old man walked to the center of the hall, to the great tree Barnstokker. He raised the sword high, and with a single powerful motion, he plunged it deep into the trunk of the living wood, burying it all the way to the hilt. A stunned silence fell over the warriors. The stranger finally spoke, his voice like the rolling of thunder. "The man who can draw this sword from this trunk," he boomed, "shall have it as a gift, and he will find that he never bore a better sword in his hand than this one." And with that, the one-eyed man turned, walked back out into the storm, and vanished, leaving behind a sword, a challenge, and a prophecy that would seal the fate of everyone in that hall. For a moment, the great hall was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. Every eye was fixed on the sword, its hilt gleaming, a divine challenge embedded in the heart of their world. The air grew thick with ambition. This was no mere weapon. It was a kingmaker, a gift from Odin himself, and every man there wanted it. The first to try was the new groom, King Sigurd of Gothland. He was a powerful man, a king in his own right, and he felt the sword was his by station. He strode forward, chest puffed with arrogance, and wrapped his hands around the hilt. He pulled. He strained, his knuckles turning white, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching like stones. The sword did not budge, not a fraction of an inch. He tried again, a grunt of effort escaping his lips, his face turning a deep, ugly red. Nothing. The great tree Barnstokker held its prize fast. Laughter, quiet at first, then louder, rippled through the hall. Humiliated, his honor stained in front of his new bride and her legendary family, Sigurd stepped back, his eyes burning with a dark fire. Then, one by one, the other great chieftains and warriors came forward. They were the strongest men in the Northlands, heroes of 100 battles. Each one tested his might against the sword. Each one failed. The challenge seemed impossible, the gift from the one-eyed god a cruel joke. Finally, only the sons of Volsung remained. 9 of them tried, the eldest first, each as strong and brave as the last. And each one, like all the others, was defeated. The sword seemed to have taken root, a permanent part of the living tree. Then came the 10th and youngest son, Sigmund. He was little more than a boy, not yet fully tested in battle, and some of the older warriors scoffed as he approached. But there was a quiet confidence in his step, a fire in his eyes that mirrored the one-eyed stranger. He laid his hands on the hilt, not with the brute force of the others but gently, as if greeting an old friend. And with a single effortless pull, the sword slid from the wood. It came free with a sound like a sigh of relief, a clear ringing note that silenced the entire hall. The blade shone in the firelight, runes of power shimmering along its length. It felt alive in Sigmund's hand, perfectly balanced, an extension of his own arm, his own will. He was no longer just the youngest son. He was the chosen one. King Sigurd's face was a mask of pure venomous envy. He saw not a boy holding a sword, but the embodiment of a glory he could never possess. He swallowed his pride, forcing a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. He approached Sigmund. "That is a fine sword," he said, his voice slick as oil. "And you are a young man. I will give you its weight in gold 3 times over. Sell it to me." Sigmund looked from the sword in his hand to the greedy king. And here we see the first true glimpse of the hero he would become. He didn't see a treasure to be sold. He saw a destiny to be fulfilled. "You could have drawn this sword from the tree as well as I," Sigmund replied, his voice clear and steady. "If it were meant for you. But it was not. And I will not sell it for all the gold in the world." The insult was clear. The rejection absolute. King Sigurd said nothing more, but the look he gave Sigmund was a promise of future pain. He hid his rage behind a veneer of royal courtesy, but the wedding feast was poisoned. An unbreakable bond of hatred had been forged that night, stronger than any marriage vow. The feast ended, and soon it was time for Sigurd and his bride, Signy, to return to his kingdom of Gothland. As he departed, Sigurd issued a formal invitation. "In 3 months' time," he announced to King Volsung, "you and all your sons must come and visit me in my lands. I will repay the hospitality of this wedding feast and bestow great honors upon you all, to seal the alliance between our families." King Volsung, a man whose entire life was built on honor and oaths, readily agreed. It was the proper thing to do. But his daughter Signy felt a cold dread grip her heart. She had seen the look in her husband's eyes. She knew the depth of his wounded pride. She went to her father in private, her face pale with fear. "Father, do not go," she pleaded. "I do not trust my husband. I have had dark dreams, visions of betrayal. His invitation is a trap. I feel it in my bones. If you must go, then gather the greatest army you can command. Do not go with just your personal guard." But King Volsung was a proud man, perhaps too proud. He saw his daughter's fear as nothing more than a new bride's anxieties. "Your words are foolish," he said, dismissing her warning. "Shall I break my sworn word to your husband because of a woman's bad dream? I have given my promise and I will keep it. A Volsung does not run from shadows." He swore he would travel to Gothland with only his 10 sons and his household guard, fearing no treachery. It was a fatal mistake. 3 months later, King Volsung and his 10 sons set sail. They landed on the shores of Gothland and saw King Sigurd waiting for them. But he was not waiting with a feast and honors. He was waiting with an army. The trap was sprung. Before the Volsungs could even draw their swords properly, they were surrounded, ambushed on the beach. There was no honor here, only betrayal. But the sons of Volsung were lions, led by their aging but still mighty father, and with Sigmund wielding the divine blade Gram, they fought with a fury that stunned the Goths. They carved a circle of death around them. For every wound they took, they dealt 3 in return. Sigmund was a whirlwind of destruction, the sword of Odin a flash of lightning in his hands, singing as it cut through flesh and bone. King Volsung himself, old as he was, fought with the strength of his youth, a king defending his sons to the last. They fought all day, against impossible odds, standing over a mountain of their slain enemies. But numbers are a cruel tide that can wear down even the greatest heroes. At last, King Volsung, the mighty patriarch, the son of Odin's son, fell. And with their king slain, the 10 brothers, wounded and exhausted, were finally overwhelmed. They were not killed but captured, bound in chains and dragged before the triumphant, sneering King Sigurd. His vengeance was not yet complete. Death was too quick, too merciful. Signy, her worst fears realized, ran to her husband, weeping, and fell at his feet. She begged him for the lives of her brothers. "Do not kill them now," she cried. "Let their shame be their punishment. Put them in stocks in the deep forest, and let them live with their defeat. It is a fate worse than death for proud warriors." Sigurd considered this. He looked at his weeping wife, and a cruel, terrible idea formed in his mind. A slow, agonizing vengeance would be so much sweeter. He agreed to her request. "As you wish, my dear," he said, a malicious smile twisting his lips. "They will not be killed by the sword. I will grant them a different kind of death." And so the 10 sons of Volsung, the greatest heroes of their age, were taken deep into the dark woods. They were bound to a massive fallen log, set in stocks, unable to move, unable to help one another. They were left alone in the darkness, defenseless, as the sun went down and the sound of howling wolves began to echo through the trees. Their true ordeal was just beginning. The first night, a great she-wolf, old and cunning, emerged from the deep woods. She was larger than any wolf a man might expect to see, her eyes glowing with a cold, ancient intelligence. She approached the 10 princes, trapped and helpless in the great beam. She sniffed at each one, and then, without ceremony, she fell upon the first brother in the line. She tore into him, devouring him completely, leaving nothing but splintered bone and bloodstains on the forest floor. The other 9 brothers could do nothing but listen to the sounds, to the snapping of bone and the tearing of flesh, their own screams echoing their brother's last moments. When she was finished, the she-wolf licked her jaws clean and slunk back into the shadows of the forest, leaving the survivors to their terror. For 9 consecutive nights, the scene repeated itself. Each night, the she-wolf would return. Each night, she would take another of Volsung's sons. The remaining brothers were driven mad by a grief and a horror that no words can truly capture. They were forced to watch, to listen, to smell the blood of their kin, all while knowing their own turn was coming. By the 10th night, only one prince remained: Sigmund. He was the youngest, the strongest, the one who had drawn the sword of Odin from the tree. He now faced the beast alone, his mind a wreck of sorrow and rage, awaiting the same grisly fate that had claimed all his brothers. But their sister Signy had not been idle. Trapped in her marriage to the monster Sigurd, she had been racking her brain for a way to intervene. She knew she couldn't launch a frontal assault, but she was a Volsung. Cunning ran in her blood just as deeply as courage. She sent a trusted servant deep into the woods, a man loyal to her and not her husband. His mission was desperate and strange. He was to find Sigmund, the last survivor, and cover his face and mouth with honey. The servant did as he was told, finding the lone, despairing prince and smearing the sweet, sticky substance all over him, even forcing some of it between his lips. Sigmund, confused but trusting his sister's wisdom, did not resist. That night, the 10th night, the great she-wolf returned. She approached Sigmund, her ancient eyes fixed on her final meal. But then she caught the scent of the honey. It was a sweet, alluring smell that drew her in. Instead of tearing into his throat as she had with the others, she began to lick the honey from his face. Her long, rough tongue darted into his mouth to get at the sweetness within. And in that moment Sigmund saw his one desperate chance. With all the strength of his Volsung blood, he clamped his jaws down on the wolf's tongue. The beast recoiled in shock and agony, yanking her head back with tremendous force. But Sigmund held on. He was a son of Odin, and his will was iron. The she-wolf thrashed and pulled, her howls of pain a terrifying sound in the night, but Sigmund's jaws were of ice. The struggle was immense, the force so great that the massive log that held him prisoner, the very instrument of his torture, split in two. At the same time, Sigmund's bite, combined with the wolf's frantic pulling, tore the creature's tongue out by the roots. The she-wolf collapsed, choking on her own blood, and died at his feet. Sigmund was free. He broke the rest of the stalks and fled into the deepest, darkest parts of the forest, a wild man fueled by grief and an all-consuming need for revenge. Signy soon found him. She brought him supplies and they met in secret, two lone survivors of a great house, plotting the downfall of a king. They knew they needed help. They needed an army, but more than that, they needed a warrior of pure Volsung blood, someone untouched by the weakness of King Sigurd's line. And here, the saga takes a turn into darkness so profound it is almost unbelievable. Signy, in her cold, calculated grief, decided that only a son born of a pure Volsung father and a pure Volsung mother could possess the strength needed for their vengeance. And in all the world, only two such people remained: herself and her brother Sigmund. Her mind, hardened by tragedy, saw only one path forward. She found a sorceress, a woman skilled in illusions and shape-shifting, and had her appearance completely changed. Disguised as a beautiful vulva, a seeress lost in the woods, she went to the secret cave where Sigmund lived. Sigmund, not recognizing his own sister, gave the mysterious woman shelter for the night. Believing her to be some wandering sorceress, he lay with her for 3 nights. She then returned to her own hall, her grim duty done. In time she bore a son, a boy she named Sinfjotli, a child who was Sigmund's son, and also his nephew, a boy who was pure Volsung on both sides, born of a desperate, unholy union forged in the fires of revenge. Before Sinfjotli came of age, Signy had 2 other sons with her husband, King Sigurd. When the eldest of these was 10 years old, Signy decided to test him. She sent him to Sigmund's hidden lair in the forest to aid his uncle. Before he left, she performed a simple test. She sewed his shirt sleeves to his skin, the needle piercing his flesh. The boy cried out in pain. Signy, disgusted, told him he was no true Volsung and sent him home. He was not worthy. She tested her second son the same way, and he too failed. They lacked the heart, the fire, the sheer toughness that defined her bloodline. Finally, when Sinfjotli was 10, it was his turn. Signy performed the same test, sewing his shirt to his arms. The boy didn't even flinch. Sigmund, who was there in secret, saw this and said, "This pain would be nothing to a true Volsung." Sinfjotli just looked at him and replied, "A Volsung would not feel a trifle like this." Signy then pulled the shirt off, tearing the skin from his arms along with the thread. Sinfjotli remained silent, unmoved. He had passed the first test. Signy then sent him to live with Sigmund in the woods. To test him further, Sigmund gave him a sack of flour and told him to bake bread. But he warned him that there was a venomous snake kneaded into the dough. Sigmund left. When he returned, the bread was baked. He asked Sinfjotli if he had found the snake. The boy replied calmly, "Yes, I found it, so I kneaded it into the dough along with everything else, and I ate it." From that day on, Sigmund knew this boy was the one. 4 years, the 2 of them lived as outlaws in the forest, training, hunting, and hardening their hearts for the war to come. They raided Sigurd's lands, killing his men and disrupting his kingdom, becoming ghosts in the woods, a constant, terrifying rumor. During their time as guerrilla warriors, they stumbled upon a strange, isolated house. Inside, 2 men were asleep, princes under an enchantment. Hanging above them were 2 magnificent wolf pelts. Sigmund and Sinfjotli, driven by a wild impulse, took the pelts and put them on. But these were no ordinary skins. They were cursed. The moment the fur touched their skin, they were transformed. They became wolves themselves, filled with a savage, uncontrollable bloodlust. They found they could not remove the skins, and that every 10th day, they would be freed, but until then, they were trapped in beast form. They embraced the curse. As 2 enormous, fearsome wolves, they rampaged through the forests of Sigurd's kingdom. They agreed that they would howl if they ever got into a fight with more than 7 men, so the other could come to their aid. But one day, Sinfjotli, young and proud, found himself facing 11 men. Without calling for help, he slaughtered them all. When Sigmund found him later, covered in blood, he was furious that Sinfjotli had broken their pact. In his rage, the wolf Sigmund lunged at the wolf Sinfjotli. He bit his son in the throat, a fatal, tearing wound. Instantly, his rage was replaced by a crushing despair. He had killed his only son, the hope of their revenge. He carried the limp body of Sinfjotli through the forest, cursing his own savagery. As he mourned, he saw 2 weasels fighting. One bit the other in the throat, and it fell down dead. But then the first weasel ran, found a specific leaf, and placed it on the wound. The dead weasel instantly sprang back to life. At that moment, a raven, the messenger of Odin, flew overhead and dropped that same kind of leaf right at Sigmund's feet. Understanding this was a sign from the Allfather, Sigmund took the leaf and placed it on Sinfjotli's mortal wound. The boy was healed immediately, and he awoke as if from a deep sleep. Their bond, tested by death itself, was now stronger than ever. Soon after, the 10th day arrived, and the curse was lifted. They built a great fire and burned the wolf skins, vowing to never again be controlled by such primal rage. They were men again, but they were changed. They were harder, more savage, and they now carried the spirit of the wolf within their human hearts. Their training was complete. It was time to return to the Hall of King Sigurd. It was time for the final vengeance. They moved through the forest not as men, but as shadows given form. The 10 years of exile, the years of hunger and cold, the years of wearing the wolfskins, had stripped them of all that was soft, all that was boyish. Sigmund and his son-nephew Sinfjotli were now instruments of vengeance, honed to a razor's edge in the deep, dark woods of King Sigurd's land. They knew every path, every stream, every hollow that could hide a man. Their home, the kingdom of the Goths, had become their hunting ground. They did not march on the hall. That would be a fool's death. Instead they watched. From the treeline they observed the comings and goings of Sigurd's warriors, learning their routines, their numbers, the times when the drink flowed most freely and the watch was at its laziest. They were patience itself, a predator's patience, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Inside the great hall, Queen Signy also waited. For 10 long years, she had played the part of the dutiful wife to the man who murdered her family. Every smile was a mask, every kind word a lie. She had borne Sigurd 2 sons, and her heart had turned to ice. She knew with a certainty that was etched into her very soul that her brother would return. And she had been preparing. One evening, as a great feast was being prepared, Sigmund and Sinfjotli crept closer than ever before. They slipped into the antechamber of the hall, a storeroom where barrels of ale were kept, and hid themselves amongst the shadows and discarded straw. From there they could hear the boisterous laughter and drunken songs of their enemies. The smell of roasting meat, a smell they hadn't known in a decade, filled the air. It was a torment, a reminder of the life that had been stolen from them. But they were not alone in their conspiracy. A message passed through a trusted servant had reached Signy. She knew they were here. She knew the final act was about to begin. But there was one last terrible test she had to perform. A test of blood. She brought her 2 young sons into the antechamber. The eldest was 10, the younger just a boy. She pointed to the dark corner where her brother and her son were hiding. She hadn't told the boys who was there, only that there were outlaws, enemies of their father the king. She wanted to see if they could be trusted, if they had any of the Volsung loyalty in their veins, or if they were entirely their father's children. She whispered to the eldest, "If these men were to be captured, would you speak up to save them, or would you let them be slain?" The boy, eager to please the father he knew as king, replied without hesitation, "I would tell my father. They are his enemies, and they should be killed for hiding in our hall." Signy's face remained a mask of stone, but inside a part of her died. She sent the boy away and brought in the younger one. She asked him the same question. The little boy, even more keen to show his bravery, said, "I would not only tell my father, I would cry out for the guards right now. We should kill them." The test was complete. The answer was clear. Her sons were Sigurd's sons. They carried his blood, his loyalty. If they knew the secret, they would betray it in a heartbeat. And that betrayal would mean the end of everything. The end of the Volsung line. The end of vengeance. Signy walked back to the shadows where Sigmund and Sinfjotli waited. Her voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. "They cannot be trusted," she said. "They will betray you. You know what must be done." Sigmund looked at his sister, at the cold abyss in her eyes. He had become a killer of men, a wolf in human form, but this was a horror he had not imagined. To kill his own nephews, innocent children. He hesitated. But Sinfjotli, born of incest and raised on hate, did not. He saw only the logic of vengeance. He saw 2 future enemies, 2 more links in the chain of their oppression. He said, "I will do it. Vengeance is not a task for the soft-hearted." Signy simply nodded, turned, and walked back into the feasting hall. Her face an unreadable portrait of grief and resolve. She had just condemned her own children to death. She had sacrificed the last remnants of her own heart on the altar of her family's honor. Later that night, when the hall was quiet and the warriors were deep in a drunken slumber, Sigmund and Sinfjotli made their move. They piled heaps of dry wood and brush against the great timber walls of the hall, working in silence, their movements practiced and sure. They blocked the main doors, leaving only one exit they could control. Then they set it ablaze. The fire took hold with a terrifying roar. The dry wood crackling and spitting as flames licked up the sides of the hall. Smoke, thick and black, poured through the thatched roof. Inside, the drunken sleep of warriors turned into panicked chaos. Men awoke choking, their eyes streaming, stumbling through the smoke-filled darkness. They scrambled for the doors, but the main entrance was a wall of fire. They rushed to the other, only to find 2 figures standing there, silhouetted against the inferno. It was Sigmund and Sinfjotli. Their swords, Gram in Sigmund's hand, flashed in the firelight. As Sigurd's men poured out, desperate to escape the flames, the 2 Volsungs cut them down. One by one, the men who had feasted at their father's table, who had stood by and watched the murder of their kin, now fell before their vengeful blades. There was no battle, only a slaughter. The wolves were in the fold, and the exits were sealed. King Sigurd, awakened by the screams and the heat, saw his world burning around him. He saw his champions being butchered at the doorway. He armed himself and bellowed into the chaos. "Who has done this? Who has brought this fire and death to my hall?" And from the doorway a voice he hadn't heard in 10 years answered, a voice forged in winter and sorrow. "It is I," Sigmund called out. "Sigmund, son of Volsung. I have returned with my kinsman Sinfjotli to reclaim the blood you owe us. The ghosts of the Volsungs are here to collect their debt." At that moment, Signy appeared at Sigurd's side. Her face was calm, serene, even as the roof beams above them began to groan and splinter. She looked at her husband, the man she had loathed for a decade, and her voice was clear and steady over the roar of the fire. "Know this, King Sigurd," she said. "Everything that has happened tonight, I have worked towards. I ensured my brothers were betrayed. I ensured my father was slain. I have lived a life of misery at your side, all for this single moment of retribution." She then turned her gaze to the doorway, to Sigmund and Sinfjotli. "And know this, my brother. The boy with you, Sinfjotli, is not only your nephew, he is your son. I came to you in the woods as a sorceress, and laid with you, so that I could bear a son with the pure, unadulterated blood of a Volsung. A son with enough fury and courage to see this vengeance through to the end." The confession hung in the fiery air, a revelation of horror and sacrifice that stunned even Sigmund. All the pieces fell into place. His sister's deception, her cold resolve, the impossible hardness in Sinfjotli. It was all part of a plan so grim, so total it was beyond comprehension. Signy looked back at her husband. "I have done all that I can to bring you down. Now my work is done. I have no more place in this world." She gave Sigmund one last look, not of triumph but of finality. "Farewell, brother. I will now go to my death with King Sigurd, as I once was forced to live with him. It is more fitting this way." And before Sigmund could even cry out, she turned and walked calmly into the heart of the inferno, disappearing into the collapsing, burning hall beside the husband she had so utterly destroyed. The great hall of the king of the Goths collapsed into a mountain of fire and ash. Silence fell, broken only by the crackling of the embers. Sigmund and Sinfjotli stood alone, their swords dripping, their faces lit by the dying flames. They had done it. They had avenged their father, their brothers, their entire line. The blood debt was paid in full. But as they stood there, amidst the ruin and the dead, they were entirely alone. They had won. They had reclaimed their honor. But they were the last two Volsungs left on earth, standing in the ashes of a kingdom they had just annihilated. Their vengeance was complete, but their story was far from over. Now they had to return to their own land, the land of the Volsungs, and see what, if anything, was left to reclaim. Their journey back was a silent one, the sea a mirror for the cold fire in their hearts. The shores of Gotland, the land of their enemies, receded behind them, a smoldering pyre marking the end of one saga and the beginning of another. For Sigmund and Sinfjotli, the world had been reduced to a singular bloody purpose for so long that the return to their own homeland felt unreal. They were no longer the hunted, no longer wolves in the dark forest. They were victors. But victory can be a hollow thing when you're standing on a mountain of corpses. When they finally landed in the realm of the Volsungs, they found not a kingdom, but a collection of territories ruled by petty chieftains who had seized power in the vacuum left by King Volsung's death. The Great Hall was a ruin, the name of Volsung a half-forgotten legend whispered by old men. Sigmund was a ghost returning to a haunted house. But he was a ghost armed with a god's sword, and a will forged in the deepest pits of hell. Reclaiming his father's kingdom was less a war and more a reckoning. Chieftain after chieftain fell before him, their armies scattering like leaves in the wind against the fury of the two last Volsungs. Sigmund, with the shards of Gram reforged into a blade that sang with ancient power, was more than a man. He was a living embodiment of his family's destiny. And Sinfjotli, his son and nephew, fought with the untamed savagery of the wolf he had once been. They were an unstoppable force, a storm of vengeance that washed the land clean of usurpers. And so, Sigmund took his rightful place on the high seat of his father, King Sigmund of the Volsungs. The title had a good ring to it. He rebuilt the Great Hall, raised the banners, and brought order to a fractured land. For the first time in a decade there was peace. But peace can be a fragile, uneasy thing for a man who has only known war. A king needs a queen. He needs an heir to carry on the line. The Volsung blood, so precious and so nearly extinguished, had to continue. Sigmund married a woman named Borghild. She was beautiful, noble, and politically it was a sound match. With her at his side, the kingdom felt whole again. The ghosts of the past seemed, for a moment, to recede. Sigmund, the aging warrior, the sole survivor of a massacre, allowed himself to hope. He had a kingdom, a queen, and in Sinfjotli, a son whose strength and loyalty were absolute. It was a new beginning. But the Norns, the weavers of fate, are not so easily cheated. They had woven a thread of tragedy into the tapestry of the Volsungs, and it was a thread that could not be unraveled. The trouble, as it so often does, began with a woman. Both Sinfjotli and Queen Borghild's brother fell in love with the same maiden, a woman of renowned beauty. They became rivals, their competition escalating from sharp words to bitter challenges. Sinfjotli, never one for subtlety or patience, saw a direct path to what he wanted. In a great contest of warriors, a duel of swords, he faced Borghild's brother. The clash was brief, brutal, and decisive. Sinfjotli, the wolfman, the veteran of 100 desperate fights, struck down the queen's brother and left him dead on the field. He returned to the hall, expecting praise for his victory. Instead, he found a cold silence. He had killed the queen's own blood. The news struck the court like a thunderclap. Queen Borghild was consumed by a grief that quickly curdled into a cold, unyielding hatred. This wasn't just a warrior falling in a fair fight. This was her brother, slain by the hand of her husband's monstrous son. Sigmund found himself in an impossible position. On one side, his son, his only remaining kin, the partner of his long revenge. On the other, his new queen, the symbol of his new life and the peace he had fought so hard to build. He tried to be a king, not just a father. He followed the ancient laws. He offered Borghild a great treasure as wergild, a blood price, gold and silver to pay for the life that was taken. It was the custom, the way these things were settled to prevent endless cycles of revenge. He pleaded with her to accept it, to let the matter be put to rest for the good of the kingdom. Borghild looked at the pile of gold, then at Sigmund, and her eyes were chips of ice. She refused. She would not accept payment for her brother's life. To her, this wasn't a debt to be paid with treasure. It was a wound that could only be salved with blood. In that moment, Sigmund must have known. The peace was over. The ghosts were back. Borghild prepared a great funeral feast in honor of her fallen brother. It was a somber, tense affair. The whole court gathered, walking on eggshells, the air thick with unspoken menace. And then the queen herself, Borghild, walked to Sinfjotli, a great drinking horn in her hands, filled to the brim with fine ale. She offered it to him, her voice sweet as honey. "Drink," she said. "A toast to the memory of the fallen." Sinfjotli was no fool. He had survived too much to be careless. He took the horn, looked at the dark liquid, and then looked to his father. He knew. He could feel the poison in it like a cold premonition. He turned to Sigmund and said, "This drink is bewitched." Now Sigmund was a man of immense power, a favorite of Odin. The sagas say that no poison could harm him, his very blood immune to its effects. He looked at the horn, then at his son, and with a kind of grim paternal arrogance, he said one of the most famous and bizarre lines in Norse mythology. "Filter it through your mustache, son." He was telling him to drink it. Perhaps he didn't believe Borghild would dare, or perhaps his own immunity made him reckless with the life of his son. Sinfjotli, trusting his father, put the horn to his lips, let the ale wet his mustache as his father had commanded, and then passed the horn back. He hadn't drunk it. Borghild's smile tightened. She took the horn, refilled it, and approached him again. This time her voice was sharper, laced with mockery. "Why let others drink your ale for you, Sinfjotli? Are you a coward? Drink it down." She was challenging his honor in front of the entire court. Again Sinfjotli hesitated. Again he looked to his father. And again Sigmund, his judgment clouded by pride or fate, gave the same strange command. "Let it pass through your mustache, son." Sinfjotli did as he was told, a second time refusing the poison. The tension in the hall was now unbearable. Everyone watched, holding their breath. This was no longer a feast, it was an execution in slow motion. Borghild returned a third time. Her face was a mask of pure venom. She held the horn out, her voice dripping with scorn. "If you have the courage of a true Volsung, you will drain this horn to the dregs." This time something broke. Perhaps it was the public shame, the relentless goading, or perhaps it was a fatal misplaced trust in his father's wisdom. Sinfjotli looked at Sigmund. The old king was drunk, flushed with ale and confidence. He was old, and he was tired of conflict in his own hall. He nodded at his son. "Drink it, if you have the heart for it." And so, with the eyes of the court upon him, Sinfjotli took the third horn. He lifted it high, met the queen's triumphant gaze, and drank it down to the very last drop. Instantly, he let out a single strangled cry, and fell to the floor dead. A horrified silence fell over the great hall. Then King Sigmund rose to his feet with a roar of pure, unadulterated anguish. The kind of sound a man makes when his entire world is ripped apart for the second time. He strode over to his son's body, his face a canvas of disbelief and agony. He lifted Sinfjotli into his arms, the mighty warrior now as limp as a child. He had lost his brothers, his sister, his father, and now his son. The partner of his exile, the instrument of his revenge, the last link to his past. Gone. Poisoned in his own hall by his own wife right before his eyes. His grief was so immense, so terrible, that it dwarfed the entire hall. He carried his son's body out into the night, walking toward the forest, howling his sorrow to the uncaring stars. When he returned, the grief had been forged into a cold, hard fury. He walked straight to Queen Borghild. There were no words, no trial, no ceremony. He simply pointed to the door. He banished her. He drove her from his kingdom that very night, sending her away with nothing but the clothes on her back, to wander the wild lands and die, or live, he didn't care which. And then he was alone. King Sigmund, lord of a reclaimed kingdom, master of a grand hall, wielder of a god's sword, and utterly, completely alone. The line of the Volsungs, once a mighty river, had dwindled to a single aging man. The hope of a new beginning had been poisoned and buried with his son. His destiny, it seemed, was to lose everyone he had ever loved. The great saga of his family was once again balanced on the edge of a knife, on the brink of extinction. And so Sigmund, the last wolf of the Volsungs, returned to his kingdom not as a triumphant avenger, but as a haunted relic. He was a king whose crown felt like a lead weight, a father whose hall echoed with the ghost of a son. He had outlived his twin sister, his nephews, and now, the ferocious boy who was the living embodiment of their shared wild past. The world had moved on, but Sigmund was anchored to his grief, a monument of sorrow in a court that desperately needed a future. How does a man who has lost everything find a reason to continue? For a king, the answer is always the same: duty. The realm needed an heir. The Volsung line, the blood of Odin himself, could not be allowed to wither and die with him. And so, his counselor spoke of marriage. A new queen, a new hope. Sigmund, old and weary, agreed. Not with passion, but with the grim acceptance of a man fulfilling the final clauses of a contract he no longer wished to be a part of. Word was sent out, and a match was proposed with the daughter of King Ilamai, a princess famed for her wisdom as much as her beauty. Her name was Jordi's. When Sigmund first laid eyes on her, perhaps something stirred in that desolate heart. She was everything his life was not: young, vibrant, a promise of spring in his endless winter. But he was not her only suitor. Another king, younger, more powerful, and burning with ambition, also sought her hand. This was King Lingvi, one of the remaining sons of King Hunding. Remember the Hundings? The sworn enemies of the Volsungs. The clan that Sigmund and Sinfjotli had decimated years ago. Lingvi's desire for Jordi's was not just about love or alliance. It was about power, and it was about spitting on the grave of his family's ancient foe. He saw Sigmund as a fading legend, a wolf who had lost his teeth. King Ilamai, Jordi's father, was a wise man. He did not choose for his daughter. He left the decision to her. He brought both kings before her and said, "You are a wise woman, my daughter. You will choose the husband you are destined for." Lingvi, confident and proud, spoke of his vast armies, his overflowing treasuries, his youth and his strength. He offered her a future of power and security. Then it was Sigmund's turn. He did not speak of wealth or of armies. He was an old man now, his face a roadmap of sorrow and war. He simply told his story. He spoke of his father, Volsung. He spoke of the sword in the tree, of his sister Signy, of the 10 years in the earth, of the vengeance they wrought. He spoke of his son, Simfjotli. He spoke of a life defined by fate, by loss, and by an unbreakable will. He offered her not a future of comfort, but a place in a saga. Geordis listened, and in the old king's story, she saw something Lyngvi could never offer. She saw greatness. She saw a lineage touched by the gods. She looked at the two kings and made her choice. Though he is old, she said, I choose King Sigmund, for he is the greatest hero in all the world. Lyngvi's face twisted into a mask of fury. This was more than a rejection. It was a profound insult. He, a king in his prime, had been passed over for a grieving old man. He swore a silent oath that Sigmund would never enjoy the prize he had won. The wedding was held, a brief flicker of light in the growing darkness. For a moment, it seemed as if Sigmund might find a measure of peace in his final years. He had a queen who respected his legacy, and the hope of a new heir to carry the Volsung name. But peace was not a gift the fates had ever granted Sigmund. King Lyngvi was true to his unspoken vow. He returned to his own lands and gathered his brothers and their armies. The blood feud, simmering for years, was about to boil over. They marched on Sigmund's kingdom, their banners dark against the sky. A storm of vengeance intent on wiping the Volsung name from the earth. Sigmund was not a man to hide behind his walls. When the scouts brought news of the approaching army, the old wolf stirred. The fire was not out yet. He gathered his warriors and his father-in-law, King Ilamai, and they marched out to meet the enemy on the open field. And as he prepared for battle, he drew his own sword. Gram. The blade pulled from the great oak, the gift of Odin. It shone in the sunlight, humming with a deadly energy, as lethal and perfect as the day he'd first claimed it. Holding it, Sigmund was no longer an old man. He was the son of Volsung. He was the fury of his ancestors made manifest. The battle that followed was the stuff of legends. At the head of his army, Sigmund was a whirlwind of destruction. He was everywhere at once, his war horns blaring a terrifying challenge. And Gram, the sword, was like a shard of light, a sliver of death itself. It sheared through helmets, clove through shields, and bit through mail as if it were cloth. No one could stand before him. The sons of Hunding sent their champions against him, and he cut them down. They sent their berserkers, and he scattered them like leaves. The old king, fighting his last battle, was winning. He and his men were pushing Lyngvi's vast army back. Victory, impossible and glorious, seemed within his grasp. But the gods who give all gifts can also take them away. As the tide of battle turned in Sigmund's favor, a figure appeared on the field. He was not a warrior in the traditional sense. He was an old man, cloaked in blue, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, shadowing his face. And he had only one eye. He carried no sword, no shield, only a simple spear. He walked through the chaos of battle as if it were a summer meadow, untouched and unafraid. He made his way directly into Sigmund's path. Sigmund, filled with the rage of battle, saw only another enemy. He raised Gram high, the divine blade ready to deliver its final victorious blow. He charged the one-eyed man, bringing the sword down in a shimmering arc that should have split the stranger in two. But the old man simply raised his spear to block the blow. And the impossible happened. Gram, the sword of Odin, the blade that had never chipped, never dulled, the sword that had cut through solid iron, struck the shaft of the old man's spear and shattered. It broke into two large pieces with a sound like cracking thunder. The divine magic that held it together undone in an instant. The light of the sword died. Sigmund stood there, stunned, holding nothing but a useless hilt. He looked up at the one-eyed man, and in that moment he understood. It was Odin, the Allfather. The god who had given him the sword had now come to reclaim his gift. His time was over. With his divine protection gone, the tide turned in a heartbeat. The enemy, seeing the legendary sword broken, surged forward with renewed courage. Spears and swords found their mark. Sigmund, the unbreakable hero, was overwhelmed. He fell, mortally wounded, and with him fell his army. King Ilamai was slain. The battle was a slaughter. The Volsung forces were annihilated. As night fell over the field of the dead, Geordis, who had been hidden away for her safety, came out to search for her husband. She moved among the bodies, a lone, desperate figure under the cold stars, until she found him. He was still breathing, but only just, leaning against a mound of the men he had slain. He saw her, and a faint smile touched his lips. "The gods have willed this," he whispered, his voice weak. "Odin no longer wishes for me to wield a sword." Jordi's wept, her tears falling on his blood-stained face. "I will find healers," she cried. "You will live." But Sigmund shook his head. "My luck is gone. I have lived a long life and fought in many battles. Odin himself has called me to Valhalla. I will go gladly." Then his eyes gained a spark of their old fire. He looked at his young wife, his queen of only a few months. "But our saga does not end here. Listen to me. You carry our son. He will be the greatest of our line." He gestured with a trembling hand to the ground beside him. "Gather the pieces of the sword. Keep them safe for him. One day, our son will reforge this blade, and he will name it Gram again. With it, he will perform deeds so great that his name will never be forgotten. His name will be Sigurd." With those final words of prophecy, the last breath left the body of King Sigmund, son of Volsung. Jordi's was alone on a field of carnage, a widow, a queen without a kingdom, hunted by the victorious sons of Hunding. But clutched in her hands were the two shards of a broken sword, and in her womb she carried the future. She carried the last, best hope of the Volsungs. Fleeing through the whispering gloom of a Scandinavian forest, a queen became a ghost. Hiordis ran, not with the grace of royalty, but with the frantic, stumbling gait of the hunted. Every rustle of leaves was the footstep of an enemy, every shadow a phantom from Hunding's clan. The weight of her grief for Sigmund was a physical stone in her chest, but it was dwarfed by the weight of the child in her womb and the cold, hard weight of the shards of Gram clutched in a linen wrap. They were the fragments of a legendary past, and the promise of a vengeful future. She and her handmaiden, desperate and exhausted, reached the coast, a gray churning sea that promised no escape. It was here that fate or the Norns spun a new thread. A fleet of longships, their dragon prows slicing through the waves, made for the shore. These were Vikings, warriors of the sea, and for a refugee queen, one band of armed men was as dangerous as another. Thinking fast, Hiordis switched clothes with her servant. The queen donned the rough-spun tunic of a thrall, and the servant wore the fine, though now torn and muddied, garments of a queen. It was a desperate gamble, a shield of anonymity. The leader of the Vikings, a man whose eyes held the keenness of a hawk, was King Alf, son of King Jalprek of Denmark. He saw the two women huddled near the woods and approached. He questioned the handmaiden, who, dressed as a queen, tried to tell their story. But King Alf's gaze kept drifting to the silent, dirt-smudged woman beside her, the one who stood with a straightness in her spine that no servitude could bend. He looked at her hands, not the calloused, work-worn hands of a thrall, but the fine hands of a noblewoman. He saw the fire in her eyes, a grief-stricken but unbroken spirit. He was a king, and he knew how to recognize a peer, no matter the disguise. He turned his full attention to Hiordis. "If you are a thrall," he said, his voice calm but testing, "then tell me this. How do you know the passing of the hours in the dead of night, when the moon and stars are veiled by clouds?" The handmaiden in her queenly robes stammered, thinking of waking for chores. But Hiordis answered, her voice low but clear. "When I was young, I was taught to mark the time by my thirst. I would wake to drink at a certain hour, and by this I knew how much of the night had passed." King Alf nodded slowly, a small smile playing on his lips. It was the answer of a high-born lady, accustomed to having water brought to her in the night. He tested her again. "And how do you know the difference between the waning of winter and the coming of spring?" Again she answered with the wisdom of the court, not the field. "The winter raven's call is for carrion," she said. "The spring bird's call is a song. The very air changes its taste. One does not need to see the first green shoot to know that the world is waking." King Alf had heard enough. "You are no thrall," he declared, his voice resonating with authority. "You are the daughter of a great king. Tell me your name and why you are in such sorrow, for I swear you will find safety and honor in my halls." And so the truth came out. Hiordis revealed she was the daughter of King Ilamai, and the widow of the great Sigmund of the Volsungs, whose pyre still smoked on the horizon. She presented the shards of Gram as proof. King Alf, who had heard the tales of Sigmund's prowess, was filled with awe and respect. He took Hiordis aboard his own ship, not as a captive, but as an honored guest, and sailed for his father's kingdom in Denmark. There, in the court of King Jalprek, Hiordis was treated with all the dignity befitting her station, and in time she gave birth to a son. He was a strong child with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of his ancestors. He had the fierce, unyielding gaze of his father Sigmund. Hiordis named him Sigurd, the Victory Guardian, a name that was both a prophecy and a burden. All the hopes of the Volsung line, all the dreams of vengeance and glory, now rested on this one small child. Sigurd grew in the Danish court, a prince without a kingdom. He was faster, stronger, and bolder than any other boy his age, but his true education began when he was fostered to a man named Regan, the king's master smith. Regan was a figure of immense skill and deep cunning. He was small of stature, but his mind was a labyrinth of ancient lore and secret knowledge. He was a master of runes, of languages, and of metalwork, but beneath his wisdom lay a heart corroded by greed and a thirst for revenge that had simmered for an age. Regan saw in the young Sigurd not just a foster son, but a tool, a weapon to be forged and aimed. He began to fill the boy's head not with simple lessons, but with epic tales. He taught him of heroes and monsters, of courage and destiny. And one day he told Sigurd his own story. A story that began long ago with 3 brothers, a hoard of gold, and the carelessness of the gods. Regan explained that his father was a great king named Hreidmar. Regan himself was the master craftsman. His one brother, Otter, was a master fisherman who could change his shape, and often spent his days as an otter, catching salmon. His other brother, Fafnir, was the strongest and fiercest of them all, his heart already touched by a deep and possessive greed. One day, 3 gods were wandering the world: Odin, the Allfather, the cunning Loki, and the quiet Honir. They came to a waterfall where Regan's brother Otter, in the shape of an otter, was lazily eating a salmon on the riverbank. Loki, ever impulsive, picked up a stone and killed the otter with a single expert throw, laughing at his good fortune. He skinned the animal, and the 3 gods, carrying the fish and the soft pelt, continued on their journey. That evening, they sought shelter at the court of King Hreidmar. They showed him their catch as a gift. Hreidmar's face turned to stone. He recognized the pelt at once. In a rage, he and his 2 remaining sons, Fafnir and Regan, seized the gods and bound them. "You have murdered my son," Hreidmar roared. "The price for this is a life for a life, or a ransom so great it defies imagination." Odin, ever the negotiator, asked the price. Hreidmar laid down the otter's skin. "First," he commanded, "you will fill my son's skin completely with gold. Then you will pile more gold around it, until not a single whisker is visible." The gods were trapped. They sent Loki, the cause of their trouble, to find such a treasure. Loki knew of only one hoard vast enough, the treasure of the dwarf Andvari. He traveled to the dark pools where the dwarf lived in the form of a pike. Using a net given to him by the sea goddess Ran, Loki caught Andvari and would not release him until the dwarf surrendered every last piece of his gold. Andvari, weeping, led Loki to his cave and gave up the glittering mountain of treasure. But as Loki gathered it, he saw the dwarf try to palm one small, simple gold ring. Loki demanded it. "Take everything else," the dwarf pleaded. "But leave me this ring, for with it, I can make more treasure in time." But Loki, knowing the terms of the ransom, snatched the ring from his hand. As Loki turned to leave, Andvari the dwarf stood at the mouth of his plundered cave and screamed a terrible curse. "That gold which was mine shall be the death of 2 brothers. It will be the cause of hatred between 8 princes. It will bring no joy to anyone. And that ring, Andvarinot, it will be the bane of every man who wears it, until it is returned to the water." Loki, unconcerned, returned to Hreidmar's hall, and the gods paid the ransom. They stuffed the otter skin with gold, and then piled the treasure high around it, covering it completely. But as they finished, Hreidmar peered closely and saw a single, tiny whisker still showing. Odin, with a sigh of grim finality, took the cursed ring from his finger and placed it over the whisker, finally hiding it from view. The ransom was paid. The gods were free. But the curse began its work immediately. Regan told Sigurd how his brother Fafnir, his soul now utterly consumed by the gold lust emanating from the hoard, murdered their own father, Hreidmar, in his sleep. He refused to share a single coin with Regan. He took the entire treasure, including the ring and Veranot, and carried it far away to a desolate wasteland called Nida Heath. There, the poison of the gold and the malice of his own heart twisted his body, transforming him into a monstrous, fire-breathing dragon, a Fafnir of legend, who would sleep upon his golden mountain and let none approach. Regan finished his tale, his eyes burning with ancient hatred. He looked at the young Sigurd, whose own eyes were wide with the horror and the glory of the story. "For years I have served in this court," Regan hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "I have waited for a hero strong enough, a spirit bold enough to be my sword of vengeance. Fafnir, my brother, is a blight upon the world, and that treasure is mine by right. You, Sigurd, you are of the Volsung blood. You are the son of Sigmund. You were born for deeds that will be sung of until the end of time." He leaned in closer, his smith's hands clenching and unclenching. "Slay the dragon for me, Sigurd. Win for yourself eternal fame. I will forge you a sword, a blade unlike any the world has ever seen. A sword fit for the son of Sigmund. All I ask is that you be the hand that finally brings justice to my family and reclaims what is mine. What say you, last of the Volsungs?" Sigurd looked at the dwarf, the fire of the forge dancing in his old, cunning eyes. The offer was a crossroads. One path led to a quiet life as a prince in Denmark. The other led into the heart of the old world, into the realm of myth, monsters, and destiny. For a son of the Volsungs there was never really a choice. "I will slay your brother," Sigurd said, his voice steady, carrying a weight far beyond his years. "I will kill this dragon Fafnir and reclaim your family's gold. But not for you, Regan. Not for your revenge. I will do it because a deed like this is not meant for a lesser man. I will do it because my blood sings for glory, not for a quiet throne." He took a step closer to the smith. "But a great deed requires a great tool. You speak of forging a sword? Then do so. Forge me a blade that will not fail in the hand of Sigmund's son. If you can do that, then we have a pact. But know this, before I hunt any dragon, I will use that sword to avenge my own father. The sons of Hunding still live, and that is a debt my honor will not allow to go unpaid." Regan's face split into a grin, a mixture of triumph and relief. He had his champion. Wasting no time, he stoked the fires of his forge until they roared like a captured sun. He selected the finest steel metals he had hoarded for just such an occasion. For days, the ring of his hammer was the only sound in the hall, a constant rhythmic beat of creation. He worked sweat and magic into the steel, folding it, quenching it, whispering secrets of the earth into the glowing metal. Finally, he presented the sword to Sigurd. It was a masterpiece. The blade was long and broad, perfectly balanced, with runes of victory etched along its fuller. It felt alive in Sigurd's hand. He took it to the great anvil, the very heart of Regan's forge, a block of iron worn smooth by centuries of labor. He wanted to feel the sword's spirit. With a mighty heave, Sigurd brought the blade down. Not on the flat, but with the edge, a test of its resilience. There was a sharp crack like ice breaking in a winter thaw. The beautiful sword shattered into a dozen pieces, the shards skittering across the stone floor. The anvil was unscratched. Sigurd looked at the hilt still in his hand, then at the stunned dwarf. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Regan was furious, his pride wounded more deeply than any blade could cut. "You know nothing of your own strength," he snarled, gathering the pieces. He threw them back into the forge, the fire consuming his failure. He would try again. This time he used even older techniques, alloys known only to the most ancient of his kind. He worked without sleep, driven by a feverish need to succeed. The second sword he forged was even more magnificent than the first. It seemed to hum with contained power, the edges so sharp they looked like slivers of twilight. Sigurd took the new sword, felt even better than the last. He hefted it, feeling the immense power coiled within the steel. Once more he strode to the anvil. He swung, putting even more of his Volsung heritage into the blow. The result was the same, a high ringing snap, and the sword lay in pieces, utterly destroyed. The anvil remained. Regan fell to his knees, his face a mask of despair. "Who are you?" he whispered. "No mortal man possesses such strength. No sword of mortal make can serve you. I have failed. Our quest is over before it has begun." But as Sigurd looked at the broken steel, a memory surfaced. A story his mother, Hiordis, had told him on quiet nights. A story of a great tree in a king's hall, of a hooded stranger with one eye, and a sword plunged to its hilt in the wood. A sword that only his father, Sigmund, could draw forth. A sword named Gram. He went to his mother's chambers. Hiordis was now queen here, married to King Alf, but she had never forgotten her first husband or the lineage of her son. Sigurd stood before her. "Mother," he said, "the sword my father carried, the one that broke in his final battle. What became of it?" Hiordis smiled, a sad, knowing look in her eyes. She went to a heavy wooden chest, bound in iron, and from its depths, wrapped in silk, she produced two large, jagged pieces of a broken blade. The steel was unlike anything Sigurd had ever seen. It seemed to drink the light from the room, and even in its shattered state, it held an aura of immense power and sorrow. "These are the shards of Gram," she said, her voice soft. "Odin himself gave this sword to your father. It was broken by Odin's own spear. I have kept them for you, my son. I knew that one day, the heir of the Volsungs would have need of his father's sword. Your destiny was forged into this metal long before you were born." Sigurd took the two halves of the sword. They felt cold and heavy with history. He brought them to the forge and laid them on the stone floor before the despairing Regan. The dwarf looked up, his eyes widening as he saw them. He crawled forward, touching the broken edges with a trembling, reverent finger. He recognized the work. Not of dwarves, not of men. This was something else entirely. "The work of the gods," Regan breathed. "No wonder my own craft failed." A new fire lit in the old smith's eyes. This was not a task, it was a privilege. He took the shards of Gram and placed them in the heart of his forge, stoking the flames to an impossible white-hot heat. As he worked the bellows, he began to chant in the old tongue of the dwarves, songs of making and unmaking, of binding fire to steel. He hammered not just with his arms but with his will. And as the pieces came together, a seam of light, bright as a star, ran down the length of the blade. When he quenched it, the forge hissed and screamed as if a living thing were being born from steam and fire. He worked for 3 days and 3 nights, polishing, sharpening, and setting the blade in a new hilt of gold and silver. When he was done, he held it aloft. It was no longer a broken relic. It was Gram reborn. The sword shone with a cold, blue light, and runes seemed to writhe and glow along its length. It looked thirsty. Sigurd took the sword. It felt like it had been a part of him his entire life. An extension of his own arm, his own soul. He did not need to test it on the anvil. He knew, but Regan had to see. First, they went to the river that flowed past the castle. Regan took a lock of wool and tossed it into the current. As the fluff drifted downstream, Sigurd simply lowered the tip of Gram into the water. The wool floated against the blade's edge and was sheared in two so cleanly, so effortlessly, that the pieces continued to float downstream as if they had never touched a thing. Regan's jaw hung open. Then they returned to the forge. Sigurd walked to the anvil, the solid, unyielding block of iron that had twice mocked the dwarf's finest work. He raised Gram high above his head. The reforged sword seemed to blaze in the firelight. He brought it down not in a wild swing but with a single focused perfect strike. There was no ringing clash of steel on iron. There was only a sound like a deep, resonant hum, and then a deafening crack that shook the entire hall. The great anvil, which had stood in that forge for 500 years, was split perfectly in half from top to bottom. The two pieces fell to the floor with a thunderous crash. Sigurd looked at the blade of Gram. It was utterly unharmed. Not a scratch, not a nick. Its edge was as keen and perfect as the moment it left the quenching trough. He turned to Regan, the light of destiny in his eyes. He was no longer a boy playing at being a prince. He was Sigurd the Volsung, and he held his birthright in his hand. "Your dragon can wait, smith," Sigurd declared, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the forge. "I have a promise to keep to my father. Gather what men you can. We march to reclaim the lands of my family, and to wash the name of Hunding from the earth in blood." Regan's eyes, which had been gleaming with avarice at the thought of the dragon's hoard, now narrowed with a different kind of fire. He saw the iron will of the Volsungs burning in the young man before him. This was not a boy to be easily manipulated. This was a king. And so the smith, ever the opportunist, bowed his head. He saw the path to the gold, and it ran through a river of blood. First, the blood of Hunding's sons, then the blood of the dragon. It made no difference to him whose was spilled, so long as the hoard was his in the end. Word spread like wildfire through the lands of King Alf. The son of Sigmund, the last of the Volsung line, had returned, and he carried a sword forged from the shards of his father's legendary blade. A sword that hummed with an ancient power. Men came. They came from the fishing villages along the coast, from the deep woods where they hunted, from the farms nestled in the valleys. They were old warriors who had served under Sigmund and remembered his glory, and they were young men who had grown up on stories of the Volsungs and yearned for a saga of their own. They saw the fire in Sigurd's eyes, the same untamable spirit that had defined his ancestors. They saw the sword Graham, and it was not just a weapon, it was a promise, a symbol that the age of heroes was not yet over. With a fleet of longships and an army of men hungry for glory, Sigurd set sail. The sea, however, is a fickle master. A great storm rose from the north, a tempest of black water and howling wind that threatened to tear their ships apart. The waves were mountains, and the sky was a churning cauldron of gray and black. For days they were tossed at the mercy of the gales, their oars useless against the might of the ocean. The men began to despair, their courage wavering. Then, through the driving rain and the mist, they saw a figure standing on a rocky headland. It was an old man, tall and imposing, wrapped in a dark cloak. He had a long gray beard, and a wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, but even from the deck of his lurching ship, Sigurd could see that the man had only one eye. The old man raised a hand, and he spoke, his voice carrying over the roar of the storm as if it were a calm summer's day. He did not shout. He simply spoke, and the world seemed to listen. He told them which way to turn their sails to catch a wind that would guide them, a wind that did not yet exist. He spoke of the battle to come, offering cryptic advice on how to arrange their shield wall, where to strike first. He called Sigurd by name, though they had never met. Sigurd, feeling a strange sense of awe and recognition, ordered his captains to follow the old man's counsel. As they turned their ships, a new wind, strong and true, filled their sails, pulling them from the storm's grasp and setting them on a direct course for the kingdom of Hunding's sons. When Sigurd looked back to the headland to thank the stranger, the old man was gone. There was no trace he had ever been there. A cold dread and a soaring hope filled Sigurd's heart in equal measure. He knew who he had seen. Odin, the All-Father, the god of his ancestors, had blessed their quest. They made landfall in a quiet fjord, their arrival a complete surprise. There was no time for Hunding's sons to muster their full strength. They scrambled to form a battle line on the plains before their fortress, a chaotic mass of men against Sigurd's disciplined shield wall. The horns blew, a gut-wrenching sound that echoed off the mountains, and the two armies charged. The clash was a symphony of slaughter. Shields splintered, spears snapped, and axes fell. The sounds of battle were a terrible chorus, the roar of men, the shriek of the wounded, the percussive clang of steel on steel. And at the heart of it all was Sigurd. He was not just a warrior, he was a storm, a force of nature unleashed. Graham, the sword of grief, was alive in his hand. It did not just cut, it sang. It sheared through iron helmets as if they were leather, clove through shields and the men who held them in a single fluid motion. Light seemed to glint and shimmer along its edge, a pale, cold fire that mesmerized its victims an instant before it took their lives. Sigurd moved through the enemy ranks like a wolf among sheep. He was seeking specific prey. He fought not for land, not for gold, but for vengeance. He called out the names of Hunding's sons, his voice a clarion call of doom above the din. One by one, they came to meet him, confident in their numbers and their strength. One by one they fell. He cut one down as the man charged on horseback, cleaving both rider and steed in two. Another he met in a duel of champions, his shield shattered by a mighty axe blow, only for Sigurd to thrust Graham straight through the man's chainmail heart. The battle turned into a rout. Seeing their leaders fall, the enemy army broke and fled. But Sigurd's vengeance was not yet complete. He hunted the last of Hunding's sons, Lyngvi, the very man who had stood with his father King Hunding when Sigmund fell. Sigurd cornered him against the gates of his own fortress. There was no duel, no honorable exchange. There was only an execution. Sigurd looked into the eyes of the man responsible for his father's death, and he felt the weight of his entire lineage, the ghosts of all the slain Volsungs standing behind him. He raised Graham high, the sword catching the last rays of the setting sun, and brought it down. The field fell silent. The groans of the dying were the only sound. Sigurd stood, breathing heavily, covered in the blood and grime of battle. The blood of his enemies. He had done it. He had avenged his father. He had reclaimed his birthright. The promise he had made in the forge was fulfilled. He looked at the carnage around him, at the bodies of the men who had followed him, and the men who had opposed him, and for the first time, he felt the terrible weight of a crown. As the survivors began to tend to the wounded and count the dead, Regan approached. He walked through the gore with a detached air, his eyes not on the victory but on Sigurd. He clapped a hand on the young hero's shoulder. "You have done it," the smith said, his voice a low rasp. "The blood debt for your father is paid. You have proven yourself a true son of the Volsungs, a king of men." Sigurd nodded, his gaze distant, still lost in the red haze of battle. Regan leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his words like poison in the ear. "You have proven you can kill men. But men are frail. Their kingdoms are fleeting. You have avenged your father, Sigmund. But what of my father, Hreidmar? What of my blood debt? You hold the sword. Now we go to kill a beast that is older than any kingdom, to claim a treasure that will make you a king of kings. We go to kill the dragon." And so they rode. Sigurd, the last of the Volsung line, and Regan, the last of a cursed family. They rode toward a place known only in whispers, a blasted wasteland called the Glittering Heath. The land grew twisted and sick the closer they came. The trees were black and skeletal, the air thick with a foul ancient stench. At the heart of this desolation was a path, worn smooth not by feet, but by the belly of a great beast, a deep furrow carved into the stone as it crawled from its lair to a nearby river to drink. This was the trail of the dragon, Fafnir. Regan, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light, laid out the plan. "No man can face a dragon head-on," he hissed. "Its breath is poison, its scales are iron. But its belly is soft. We will dig a pit in the dragon's path. You will hide within it. When Fafnir crawls over you to get to the water, you will thrust Graham upward, straight into his heart." It was a cunning plan born of a smith's mind, all angles and leverage. Sigurd, young and eager for glory, agreed. He took up a shovel and began to dig. The work was hard, the ground like iron. As he dug, a stranger appeared, an old man with one eye, wrapped in a dark cloak, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. The old man watched him for a moment. "That is a deep grave you dig," he said, his voice like the rumbling of distant thunder. "But you only dig one. What will you do when the dragon's blood pours down? It is a river of fire and venom. It will fill this trench and boil you alive." Sigurd paused, looking at the stranger. He had seen this man before, in the court of kings on the eve of battles. It was Odin. "Dig more trenches," the wanderer advised, pointing with his staff. "Channels to lead the blood away. Let the earth drink the poison, not you." And with that, the old man was gone, vanishing as if he were never there. Sigurd did as he was told. He dug a web of smaller trenches leading away from the main pit. Then he concealed himself in the darkness, clutching the hilt of Graham, the sword that had tasted the world tree. He waited. He did not have to wait long. The ground began to tremble. A low rumble grew into a deafening roar that shook the very stones around him. A shadow fell over the pit, blotting out the sky. Then came the stench, a wave of sulfur and death. Fafnir was coming. Through a crack in the covering, Sigurd saw the beast. It was larger than any tale had ever described. Its scales shimmered like 1,000 black mirrors. Its eyes burned with ancient malice. It moved with a terrible reptilian grace, the ground groaning under its immense weight. As the dragon slithered over the pit, its vast, soft underbelly was exposed. This was the moment, the culmination of his entire life. For his father, Sigmund. For the Volsungs. Sigurd raised Graham with both hands, its edges glowing with a faint, cold light. He put all of his strength, all of his rage, and all of his destiny into a single upward thrust. The sword slid between the scales as if they were cloth. It plunged deep into the dragon's heart. A shriek tore through the heavens, a sound of pure agony and rage that shattered rock and split the sky. The dragon writhed, crashing against the earth like a falling mountain. A torrent of black, steaming blood erupted from the wound, pouring down like a waterfall. It flooded the trenches Odin had told him to dig, a boiling river of venom that would have been his tomb. Fafnir, in his death throes, turned his massive head toward the pit. "Who are you?" the dragon rasped, its voice a dying thunder. "Who is the boy who has slain me?" "I am Sigurd," he called out, "son of Sigmund, of the Volsung clan." The dragon gave a final rattling laugh. "The Volsungs? I should have known. Listen to my last words, son of Sigmund. The gold I guarded, it is cursed. It was my doom and it will be yours. It brings only greed, betrayal, and death to all who possess it." With that, the great beast's fire went out, and the monster that was once a man lay still. Sigurd crawled from the pit, drenched in sweat but untouched by the blood. Regan ran to him, his face a mask of triumph and avarice. "You've done it. You have slain the beast. Now, as is my right, you must roast the heart for me. I must eat it to regain the wisdom and strength of my family." Sigurd, bound by his oath, cut the heart from the dragon's chest and set it on a spit over a fire. As the heart cooked, a drop of its hot fat dripped onto his thumb. He instinctively put his thumb in his mouth to cool it, and in that instant the world changed. The chirping of the birds in the skeletal trees nearby was no longer just noise. He understood them. They were speaking. "There sits Sigurd," one bird chirped to another, "roasting Fafnir's heart for another. If he ate it himself, he would be the wisest of all men." A second bird answered, "There stands Regan, who means to betray him. He plans to kill the boy and take all the gold for himself." A third bird sang, "Sigurd should be wise. He should cut off Regan's head and keep the gold for himself. Then he can ride to the mountain of Hindrfjall, where the Valkyrie Brynhild sleeps in a ring of fire, waiting for a hero worthy of her." The words of the birds were a sudden, cold revelation. Sigurd looked at Regan, and for the first time, he saw past the friendly mentor, past the master smith, and saw the bitter, greedy creature that Fafnir's curse had promised. He saw the brother of the dragon. Regan approached, a knife hidden behind his back. But Sigurd was faster. He drew Gram, the sword still humming with the dragon's death. And with a single stroke, he struck off Regan's head. He was alone. The Avenger, the Dragonslayer, the Kinslayer. He stood in silence on the glittering heath, the bodies of two brothers at his feet. He then did what the birds had advised. He ate a piece of Fafnir's heart, and felt an ancient knowledge flood his mind. The rest he saved. He walked to the dragon's lair, a cave carved into the rock, and there he saw it, the treasure of the dwarves, a mountain of gold that defied imagination, piles of rings, jeweled swords, golden armor, and coins from forgotten kingdoms. It was a king's ransom 10 times over, and at the very top of the pile lay a single simple gold ring. Andvari, the source of the curse. Sigurd loaded the treasure onto his horse, Grani, who had refused to be mounted by anyone else. The great horse, descended from Odin's own steed, barely seemed to notice the weight. And here, the saga of Sigurd the Dragonslayer truly begins. But it's also where our story must end, because in this moment, the blueprint for modern fantasy was forged. Think about it. A young hero, heir to a lost kingdom. A shattered sword, reforged to reclaim his birthright. A wise, wandering old mentor with a staff and a pointy hat who offers cryptic advice. A dragon, Fafnir, obsessed with his golden hoard, slain by a secret weakness in his belly. Does this sound familiar? J.R.R. Tolkien didn't just borrow from the saga of the Volsungs. He drank from it as from a deep well. Sigurd is the prototype for Aragorn, the heir of Isildur. Gram, the sword broken and remade, is Narsil, reforged into Anduril, the flame of the west. The greedy, cunning dragon Fafnir is the direct ancestor of Smaug the Magnificent. And the cursed ring Andvari, which brings ruin to all who possess it, well, that is the one ring to rule them all. The Volsunga Saga is more than just a dusty old myth. It is the source code. It's the epic from which 1,000 other epics have been born. It teaches us that the greatest treasures are often the most terrible curses, that heroism is inseparable from tragedy, and that the path to glory is almost always paved with blood and sorrow. The story of Sigurd continues, leading him to a shield maiden sleeping in a ring of fire, to love, betrayal, and an ending far more tragic than you can imagine. But that is a saga for another time. For now, we leave him on the glittering heath, a king's fortune on his horse, a dragon's wisdom in his mind, and a terrible curse hanging over his head. the last of the Volsungs who slew a dragon and in doing so, created the mold for every fantasy hero who would ever follow.